It was a bright afternoon in Madrid, the kind that made the streets glow golden with sunlight. People were gathered near the old concert hall, a place known for its grand performances and famous musicians. Inside, the sound of violins tuning filled the air, mixed with the low hum of a crowd waiting for the rehearsal of one of Europe's most respected orchestras. Among the audience that day sat a young woman named Isabella Cruz, visiting from a small town in Mexico. She was quiet, almost shy, sitting near the back rows where no one would notice her. Her clothes were simple, a plain white blouse and an old denim skirt, and her long dark hair was tied back neatly. She didn't look like someone who belonged in such a grand hall. But her eyes told another story. They sparkled with admiration as she watched the musicians take their places. Music had always been her world. Back home, she didn't have a proper piano. Only a small second-hand keyboard she'd bought with her savings from helping her mother sell food in the market. She practiced whenever she could, teaching herself by watching videos and listening to old recordings. She could play by ear, and though she couldn't read every note perfectly, her heart understood what the music wanted to say. That day, she had come to Madrid not to perform, not even to be noticed, but simply to listen, to experience music at its purest. For years, she had dreamed of hearing a full orchestra live, not through cheap headphones or online clips. To her, this was a moment of magic. As the lights dimmed slightly, the conductor stepped onto the stage. He was a tall man in his 50s, elegant and confident, known across Europe as one of the finest maestros. His name was Maestro Laurent, and his reputation was built not only on skill but on his pride. People said he could tell everything about a musician just by watching how they held their instrument. When the orchestra began to play, Isabella felt her chest tighten with emotion. The strings rose like waves, the brass joined with power, and the drums thundered softly in the background. It was more than sound, and it was life itself. She closed her eyes, letting each note sink into her soul. During a short break, the musicians relaxed, laughing and chatting with one another. The audience was small, mostly students, reporters, and a few invited guests. Maestro Laurent, pacing near the piano, seemed in good spirits. That's when he noticed Isabella sitting quietly at the side, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes still following every movement of the players. He gave her a curious glance. "You there," he said in a light voice that carried across the room. Everyone turned to look. Isabella froze. "Me?" she asked softly. "Yes, you," he replied, smiling faintly. "You've been watching very closely. Are you a musician?" The people nearby chuckled. A few whispered things like, "She probably just loves music," or "She doesn't look like a performer." Isabella blushed, her voice barely above a whisper. "A little," she said. "I play piano back home." "Oh?" The conductor raised an eyebrow, amused. "A pianist from Mexico? That's quite far from here." He looked around the hall, then added jokingly, "Would you like to show us what you can do?" The musicians laughed politely. It was meant as light humor, a way to break the silence, but the way he said it carried a small edge, not cruel but slightly condescending, as if he didn't expect much. Isabella's heart began to race. "Oh no, I couldn't," she said quickly. "I just came to listen." "Nonsense," the maestro said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Music is for everyone. Come, play a few notes. Let us hear how music sounds from your part of the world." The room murmured with interest. Some were curious, others skeptical. The pianist who had been rehearsing stood up, half amused, and gestured toward the piano. "Go ahead," he said kindly. "It's all yours." Isabella's palms began to sweat. She looked around, searching for a polite way to decline, but everyone's eyes were on her now. She didn't want to look rude or ungrateful. Slowly, she rose from her seat. Her steps were small, hesitant. The heels of her worn shoes clicked softly against the wooden floor. As she approached the piano, she felt her breath grow shallow. She could feel the weight of every stare, the musicians, the maestro, the few guests scattered across the seats. To them, she was just an ordinary visitor, maybe even a little out of place. The piano itself was grand, a glossy black Steinway shining under the hall lights. It looked nothing like the small, slightly broken keyboard she had back home. She reached out and gently touched one of the keys, almost afraid it might scold her for daring to try. The conductor crossed his arms, still smiling. "Play whatever you wish," he said. "Just a few notes, perhaps." She nodded quietly, still unsure. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. For a moment she thought about stepping away, making an excuse, saying she was too nervous. But then she remembered something her mother always told her. Don't be afraid to show your gift even if people laugh first. Some will only understand after they listen. Taking a slow breath, she pressed her first note. The sound was soft, uncertain, but pure. The echo spread through the hall like a small wave. The audience waited. The musicians exchanged glances, some amused, others curious to see where this would go. Isabella didn't start playing right away. She sat there, eyes closed for a second, as if listening to something deep inside her. The maestro tapped his baton lightly, a bit impatiently. Well, go on, he said. We're all ears. She smiled nervously, her heart thumping in her chest. Back home, she used to play for the old women at church, for the children who danced barefoot outside her window, and for her father who always said music was the only thing that made the hard days softer. Those memories filled her now, and slowly her fear began to fade. I'm sorry if I play differently, she said quietly. I don't know all the right techniques. Just play, Maestro Laurent said, half teasing. Music will tell us what it needs to. Her hands found their place on the keys again. She played a gentle pattern, a few simple chords that sounded like the beginning of a lullaby. The sound was fragile at first, but there was emotion behind every note. It wasn't the clean, precise playing of a trained professional. It was raw, human, alive. The room fell strangely quiet. Even those who had laughed earlier stopped whispering. There was something in her touch, a kind of honesty that didn't need perfection to be beautiful. Maestro Laurent, who had been smiling with polite amusement, now tilted his head slightly. He didn't say a word. Isabella stopped after a few bars, pulling her hands back. I'm sorry, she said softly. That's all I remember right now. The conductor looked at her with mild surprise. That's quite all right, he said after a pause. It's interesting. The pianist who had given her his seat nodded respectfully. You play with feeling, he said. Isabella smiled, a little embarrassed. Thank you, she whispered, then stepped away from the piano. As she returned to her seat, she could feel the mixed expressions around her. Curiosity, confusion, even a little admiration. She didn't know if they had truly liked her playing or were just being polite. But for her, it didn't matter. She had played on a grand piano in a real concert hall, even if only for a minute. That was something she would remember forever. But Maestro Laurent was still thinking. Something about the way she played lingered in his mind. It was as if her music carried a story he couldn't quite understand. During the next break, he glanced toward her again. She was sitting quietly, her eyes on the orchestra, her hands folded neatly. There was a calm confidence about her now, a quiet dignity that he hadn't noticed before. He leaned toward his assistant and whispered, There's something about that girl. She plays like she's seen the soul of music. The assistant smiled. Maybe you should let her play again later, he joked. The conductor didn't reply. But deep inside, he was intrigued. He didn't like to admit that a self-taught girl from a small town could stir something in him that years of polished performances hadn't. Isabella, unaware of his thoughts, simply enjoyed the rest of the rehearsal. She tapped her fingers lightly on her knees in rhythm with the orchestra. Every note, every swell of sound felt like a gift. She wasn't part of the performance, but she felt deeply connected to it. As the musicians prepared for their final piece, the conductor looked her way one more time. He smiled, a real smile this time, softer, thoughtful. She smiled back, though she didn't know why. Something told her that this small, unexpected moment, this quiet invitation to touch the piano, was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning of something much bigger than she could imagine. Outside the concert hall, the evening light began to fade, and the city lights shimmered on the cobblestone streets. Isabella stepped out, holding her small bag close to her chest. The sound of the orchestra still echoed in her mind. She walked slowly through the narrow lanes, humming the same tune she had played on stage. She didn't know that her few simple notes had left an impression that would soon return to her in the most surprising way, one that would change not only her life but also the hearts of everyone who had heard her play. The next morning, Isabella woke up before the sun. Her small room in the hostel smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. She could hear the city slowly coming alive outside her window. The faint hum of cars, footsteps of people heading to work, and the occasional shout of a street vendor selling fruit. Despite the noise, she felt a quiet excitement inside her chest, the kind that refused to go away no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. The memory of the previous day kept replaying in her mind. The sound of the grand piano, the orchestra filling the room with warmth, and the conductor's curious glance. It all felt surreal. She had never imagined that a simple visit to listen to music would lead to her playing in such a grand hall. She didn't know if what she had done counted as good, but she knew that her music had been honest. That thought gave her a strange mix of pride and fear. She dressed quickly in simple clothes again, tying her hair back. Her hands instinctively hovered for a moment as if playing an invisible piano in the air. It was a habit she had developed over years of practice, and it gave her a strange sense of calm. Today, however, she didn't just feel calm. She felt as if something important was about to happen. When she arrived at the concert hall, the staff welcomed her with polite smiles. Some remembered her from yesterday. Some only recognized her as a quiet guest. She made her way to the side entrance and quietly watched the musicians rehearse once again. The orchestra was already in full swing, their instruments blending perfectly, creating a tapestry of sound that made her chest tighten with awe. As she watched, the conductor appeared again. This time he seemed more deliberate, scanning the room as if looking for something beyond just music. When he noticed Isabella, he walked over slowly, his expression unreadable. "You're here early," he said, his voice softer than yesterday. "I couldn't sleep," Isabella replied honestly. "I kept thinking about the music. I couldn't stop hearing it in my head." He nodded, almost as if he understood more than he let on. "You have an unusual way of listening," he said. "Most people sit quietly, but their minds wander. Yours stays with the music. It notices details." Isabella felt a warmth spread across her face. Compliments were rare in her life, especially from someone so important. She didn't respond, simply looking down and tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Tell me," the conductor continued, leaning slightly closer. "Do you ever play for an audience beyond your town?" "No," she said softly. "I play for my family, for neighbors sometimes, and for anyone who wants to listen. That's all." He studied her for a moment, then his eyes flicked toward the grand piano. "Would you like to play again today?" Isabella froze. The words felt heavier than yesterday's invitation. She hadn't expected him to ask, and suddenly her nervousness returned tenfold. I don't think I should," she stammered. He smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to carry no judgment. "It is not about whether you should or shouldn't. It is about whether you can. Just play a few notes and let the music speak." She hesitated, her mind racing. What if she made a mistake? What if everyone laughed, or worse, ignored her again? And yet there was a pull she could not resist, a silent urging that told her that this moment might not come again. She slowly walked toward the piano. Her steps were deliberate, careful, each one echoing softly in the high-ceilinged hall. Her heart pounded in her chest, but this time there was no panic, only a strange determination. When she reached the piano, she paused. Her fingers hovered above the keys, and she took a deep breath. She remembered the advice her mother had once given. Play with your heart, not just your hands. The world will feel it, even if they don't understand it yet. The conductor stepped back, giving her space. The musicians around her watched quietly, their curiosity palpable. Some whispered softly to each other, wondering what a small-town girl from Mexico could possibly play that might match the orchestra's skill. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her family, her town, the small church where she had spent hours playing for an empty room. She thought about the markets, the street vendors, the laughter of children dancing in the dusty streets. She let all those memories fill her mind, and then she pressed a single key. The note rang out pure and clear, carrying with it a hint of something more than just sound, a feeling of life, of struggle, of hope. The conductor's brow lifted slightly. Even the musicians paused, sensing that this was not just a simple tune. She continued, letting her fingers move naturally, improvising as she went. She didn't follow a strict rhythm or a written score. Instead, she let her emotions guide her. Sometimes her hands moved softly, gently brushing the keys. Other times, they struck with intensity, making the sound bold and commanding. The music began to draw the attention of everyone in the room. The orchestra members, initially skeptical, began to listen more intently. They watched as she created melodies that felt both familiar and new, blending simplicity with passion. Every note seemed to tell a story, of a girl from a faraway town, of dreams carried through hardship, of music as a language that needed no translation. The conductor, who had seen countless musicians over decades, felt a stirring he had not experienced in years. He was a man accustomed to perfection, trained precision, and flawless technique. Yet here was a young woman who had never studied at a conservatory, playing with an honesty and depth that made his heart race. As Isabella played, a transformation began to occur in the room. The air felt alive, charged with something intangible. The audience, even those who had come expecting a rehearsal, sat up straighter, leaning forward in their seats. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, while others exchanged glances filled with wonder. The young woman didn't notice them. She was lost in the music, in the story her fingers were telling. She forgot about fear, judgment, and doubt. All that existed was the piano, the notes, and the emotion flowing between them. After several minutes, she reached a part of the melody that felt particularly bold. She struck the keys with force, letting the sound fill every corner of the hall. It was a daring move, one she hadn't planned, yet it felt right. The resonance lingered, vibrating through the floorboards, through the walls, through the hearts of everyone present. For a moment, silence followed. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Even the conductor, who had begun to sway subtly to the rhythm, stopped moving, letting the last note hang in the air. Then slowly applause began to ripple through the room, first tentative, then louder, until it became a wave of appreciation. The orchestra members exchanged amazed looks. Some whispered quietly, "Did you hear that? She's incredible." Others simply shook their heads, unable to believe the depth of feeling in such an unexpected performance. The conductor walked slowly toward her, his expression unreadable. Isabella, realizing she had finished, pulled her hands back and looked at the piano, her chest heaving. She felt exposed yet exhilarated. She had given everything she could, and now she waited for judgment. Instead of criticism, he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "You have a gift," he said softly. "A rare kind of talent. Not something taught in a classroom, but something born from life itself." Isabella's eyes widened. She hadn't expected praise, only polite acknowledgement at best. Hearing these words made her heart swell, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. The conductor nodded, then gestured toward the orchestra. "They have heard you. They understand now that music is not only about skill, but about truth. You've reminded us of that." Isabella looked at the musicians, many of whom were smiling, some nodding in respect. She realized that in that moment she was no longer just a visitor. She was part of something bigger, something that transcended her fears and limitations. After the applause subsided, she returned to her seat quietly, still trembling slightly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't know what would happen next, whether anyone would ask her to play again or if this was just a fleeting moment. But deep inside she felt a spark, a belief that she could belong in this world of music, even if only for a little while. Outside the concert hall later that day, the city lights shimmered on the streets, reflecting in the puddles left by a brief afternoon rain. Isabella walked slowly, replaying the scene in her mind. She felt a mixture of exhaustion and elation, her heart still racing from the performance. She had faced the challenge, stepped into the unknown, and emerged with something precious. Not fame, not recognition, but the realization that her music mattered. Little did she know this small, quiet moment was the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever, opening doors she had never imagined and bringing her music to places she had only dreamed of. The next rehearsal day arrived, and Isabella found herself walking toward the grand concert hall with a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness. The streets of Madrid were busier than usual, the chatter of people blending with the clatter of trams and distant music from street performers. She carried a small notebook with her, filled with sketches of melodies she had improvised in her room the night before. She didn't know if anyone would ever see them, but somehow writing them down gave her a sense of courage. Inside the hall, the musicians were already tuning their instruments. The rich smell of polished wood and waxed floors mingled with the faint scent of coffee from a nearby cafe. Isabella quietly took a seat near the back again, as she had done the first day. Her hands itched to play, but she told herself to be patient. She had learned that big moments often arrived quietly, and sometimes you had to wait for them to find you. The conductor entered with his usual confident stride, his coat sigh, sweeping the floor lightly. He stopped briefly at the piano, running a hand across the smooth black surface as if he were greeting an old friend. Then his eyes fell on Isabella, and for a moment the room seemed to pause. "You're here again," he said softly, a hint of surprise in his voice. "I didn't expect you so soon." "I couldn't resist," she admitted, smiling faintly. "I wanted to hear more, and maybe I could try again." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Today I think we might try something different. Not just a few notes, but a short piece, something that shows what you can do." Isabella's heart raced. A short piece? That sounded much more serious than yesterday. She glanced around nervously. The musicians were watching her with curious expressions. She could feel their skepticism, but also a subtle interest, the kind that grew when someone unexpected might surprise you. "I don't have a prepared piece," she said quietly. "I can try to improvise something." "Good," the conductor said, his voice firm but encouraging. "Improvisation is the soul of music. Play what you feel." She walked toward the piano again, her steps measured, but this time she didn't hesitate. Yesterday had shown her that she could step forward, that the fear could be managed, that the music inside her could speak louder than doubt. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining the streets of her hometown, the small plaza where children danced, the market where her mother sold bread and fruit. She thought about the sun rising over the hills and the smell of earth after rain. Slowly, her fingers pressed down on the first notes, soft and tentative. The sound filled the hall, but this time, Isabella did not stop. She let the melody flow, weaving simple chords with little flourishes that reflected her emotions. She played as if she were telling a story without words, a story of struggle and hope, of long days and quiet victories. Each note seemed to carry a piece of her heart. The musicians began to lean in. A violinist paused mid-tune to listen. A cellist lowered his bow. The room, usually filled with chatter and preparation, fell quiet, giving her space to create. Even the conductor, who had seen thousands of performances in his life, seemed captivated. Isabella's confidence grew with each measure. She started to experiment, letting her hands move faster than slower, emphasizing notes that seemed to demand attention. Sometimes she played softly, almost whispering through the piano, and sometimes she struck the keys with boldness that made the floor vibrate. After a few minutes, she felt the music building inside her. She reached a part of the melody that was entirely new, something she hadn't planned. Her fingers danced across the keys, moving with a freedom that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. She knew that this moment was fragile, that one wrong note could ruin it, but she didn't care. She was no longer thinking about the audience or the orchestra. She was lost in the music, and the music was lost in her. The conductor's eyes widened slightly. He raised his hands to motion the orchestra almost instinctively, but then hesitated. He realized that what she was creating didn't need accompaniment yet. It was raw, pure, and completely hers. The musicians watched, fascinated. They had rehearsed countless pieces, followed endless instructions, and performed with precision night after night. But this was different. It had life. It had personality. It had a soul. Isabella played for what felt like both a moment and an eternity. She poured everything into the piano, her memories, her dreams, her fears. She felt her heartbeat matching the rhythm, her breath guiding the tempo. Every sound she produced seemed to echo her life experiences. The joy of small victories, the sadness of missed opportunities, the hope that tomorrow might be brighter. Suddenly she felt a shift. The room no longer felt intimidating. She didn't hear whispers or laughter. She didn't see skeptical glances. She felt only the music, her connection to it, and the strange understanding that it could touch others in ways words never could. A few musicians quietly picked up their instruments, adding subtle harmonies, careful not to overpower her. A soft cello line wove beneath her melody. A violin echoed a gentle counterpoint. The conductor finally raised his baton fully, guiding the orchestra to join her improvisation slowly, almost reverently. The hall transformed. What began as a small solo now became a gentle duet and then a fuller symphony. Isabella's music led the orchestra, her emotions shaping the performance. The audience, who had expected a rehearsal, were witnessing something extraordinary. They leaned forward, their eyes wide, their hearts open to the sound filling the room. When she reached the final section of her improvisation, Isabella paused, letting a single chord linger in the air. The note resonated, fading slowly but with weight, like a story coming to its natural end. Silence followed, a silence that was not empty but full of meaning. The conductor stood frozen for a moment. He had seen brilliance before, but nothing like this. He approached Isabella slowly, his face a mixture of astonishment and respect. "You have more than talent," he said softly. "You have vision. You see music in a way that is rare, almost forgotten." Isabella's chest heaved, not from exhaustion but from emotion. She had played with honesty, and the recognition, the understanding from someone so experienced, moved her more than she could describe. The orchestra members looked at each other, nodding in silent agreement. A few whispered quietly, "She's incredible. I've never heard anything like this, and where has she been hiding all this time?" The conductor motioned for the audience to applaud. The sound was immediate and overwhelming, rising like a wave, filling every corner of the hall. Some stood up, clapping enthusiastically. Others wiped away tears, moved by the honesty in her playing. Isabella smiled shyly, bowing slightly. She had never imagined that her music could have this effect. She had played for herself, for her memories, and for her love of the piano, and yet it had reached everyone around her. After the applause, the conductor walked beside her as she returned to her seat. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we may have an opportunity for you to play with the full orchestra, in front of a larger audience. Are you willing?" Isabella's hands trembled slightly, but she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "I would like that." "Good," he said, a hint of a smile on his lips. "You are ready for it. Trust yourself, and the music will guide you." As the rehearsal continued, Isabella sat quietly, listening to the orchestra with renewed respect. She realized that her journey was only beginning. She was no longer just a visitor or a small-town pianist. She was someone who could share her music with the world, someone whose voice through the piano could touch hearts far beyond her hometown. Outside, Madrid was bathed in golden afternoon light. Isabella walked slowly through the streets afterward, feeling a strange lightness in her step. She hummed the melody she had just played, letting it echo in her mind. People passed by without noticing her, but she felt connected to them all in a way she had never felt before. She thought about her family, about the small keyboard back home, and about the long hours she had spent teaching herself to play. Everything had led to this moment: the doubts, the small victories, the endless practice, and the love of music. She realized that even the tiniest steps in life could lead to experiences that changed everything. That evening, she sat by a small window in her hostel room, looking at the lights of the city. She took out her notebook and began writing down the melody she had played that morning, noting the feelings it had carried, the moments that had moved her. She wanted to remember every detail, every sensation, so that when tomorrow came, she could pour it all into the piano once more. She didn't know what the future would hold. She didn't know if she would become famous or remain just a small-town girl with a gift. But she knew one thing. The music inside her was real, and it had the power to change the room, the audience, and even the hearts of those who heard it. That realization was more valuable than any applause, more important than any recognition, and as she drifted off to sleep that night, the faint echoes of the grand piano in her mind reminded her of something she had always known deep down. Music is not about being perfect. It is about being true. The next day, the air in the concert hall felt different. It wasn't just the hum of tuning instruments or the scent of polished wood that made it special. There was a quiet energy, a sense that something unexpected was about to happen. Isabella arrived early, as she had the previous day, carrying her small notebook and a sense of nervous anticipation. The streets of Madrid outside were alive with people hurrying to work, vendors shouting softly, and the occasional clatter of trams on the cobblestone streets. But inside, everything felt calm, almost sacred. She walked into the hall and paused near the piano. It looked the same, glossy and imposing, but today it felt like more than an instrument. It was a portal, a place where she could share the story inside her, where her music could speak for her without words. The conductor entered shortly afterward, his coat brushing lightly against the floor. He had a look of expectation on his face, but also something she hadn't seen before, a hint of respect. He greeted her quietly, not with the playful teasing of the first day, but with the seriousness that told her he genuinely wanted to see what she could do. "Today," he said softly, "we will try something new. The audience will be larger, and the orchestra, is ready. You will not play alone this time. Are you prepared?" Isabella felt her stomach tighten, but she nodded. "I think so," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter inside her. He motioned to the musicians, and they began to assemble. Violins, cellos, flutes, and percussion all took their places. The hall was starting to feel alive, every corner vibrating with anticipation. Isabella could see a few familiar faces from yesterday, some students, some reporters, but today there were more people, and the air felt heavier with expectation. She took a deep breath and sat at the piano, her fingers brushing lightly across the keys. She didn't need to think about the first note. It came naturally, soft and clear. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel the room, the orchestra, and the audience as one. She felt small in the vast space, yet connected to everything around her in a way that felt powerful. The conductor raised his baton, but this time he didn't start the orchestra immediately. He let Isabella's first few notes linger in the air, allowing the sound to fill the hall completely. A hush fell over everyone as if they were all holding their breath, waiting to see where the music would go. She began to play more confidently now, weaving a melody that carried a story. It was a mix of the folk tunes she had grown up with and the classical music she had admired for years. Her fingers moved fluidly, almost as if they had a mind of their own. She felt a strange freedom, a sense that she was not just playing notes but sharing pieces of her life, her memories, and her dreams. The orchestra listened closely, not playing yet, but reacting subtly. A violinist leaned forward, following her rhythm. The cellist adjusted the bow, matching the rising tension in her music. Even the percussionists paused, feeling the energy she was creating. After a few minutes, the conductor lifted his baton fully and slowly guided the orchestra to join her. The musicians followed her lead carefully, blending their sound with hers rather than overpowering it. The hall transformed. What had started as a solo had become a living, breathing symphony. Isabella's heart raced, but she didn't falter. She had learned that music was not about perfection, but about truth. She let every emotion guide her fingers, joy, longing, hope, and even fear. She could feel the orchestra responding, their notes rising and falling with hers, creating harmonies that were alive and unpredictable. The audience was mesmerized. They had come expecting a rehearsal, a practice session, but what they were witnessing was something entirely different. Some closed their eyes, letting the music speak directly to them. Others leaned forward in their seats, unable to look away. Children sitting quietly with their parents seemed to understand instinctively, swaying slightly to the rhythm. Isabella reached a part of the piece that required courage. The melody shifted, becoming more daring, more complex. Her fingers struck the keys with intensity, demanding attention, and the orchestra followed her without hesitation. Every note she played carried her heart, her story, and the echoes of her past. She remembered the small town in Mexico, the market, the church, the people who had encouraged her quietly over the years. They were all there in the music, and the hall felt fuller for it. The conductor, who had been guiding the orchestra carefully, now allowed himself to be carried by her music. His movements became fluid, almost like a dance, and he encouraged the musicians to follow her spontaneity rather than stick strictly to the score. For the first time in years, he felt completely present in a performance that was alive and unscripted. The audience's reaction was subtle at first, a soft murmur of appreciation, the shift of bodies leaning forward in their seats. But as the music grew, so did the recognition of its beauty. People began to clap quietly, their hands moving almost instinctively with the rhythm. Others whispered to one another, astonished that such emotion could emerge from someone they had never heard of. Isabella felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and humility. She had never performed like this in front of such an audience, and yet, every note felt natural, as if it had been waiting inside her all along. She played with everything she had, knowing that the music was bigger than herself, that it belonged to everyone in the room. When she reached the final section, she slowed her pace, letting each note linger just long enough to carry its weight. The orchestra followed, their sound swelling gently, supporting her without overshadowing her. The final chord echoed through the hall, vibrating in the walls and the floor, filling the space with a sense of completion. For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full of wonder. The conductor lowered his baton slowly, his eyes fixed on Isabella. He didn't need to speak. The look in his eyes said everything. He had witnessed something rare and beautiful, something that would stay with him and the orchestra forever. Then the applause began, slowly at first, then growing louder and louder, until it became a wave of sound that filled the entire hall. People stood clapping enthusiastically, some with tears in their eyes. Even the musicians had smiles on their faces, their usual professionalism replaced with genuine admiration. Isabella's hands trembled as she bowed slightly, a shy smile on her face. She had never experienced anything like this before. It wasn't just the applause that moved her, but the realization that her music had touched others in ways she couldn't fully describe. She had shared something deeply personal, and the world had responded. The conductor approached her carefully, not wanting to startle her. "You have a gift," he said softly. "A rare kind of gift. You see music in a way that is beyond technique. You feel it, and that makes it extraordinary." Isabella blinked, trying to absorb his words. She had never thought of herself in those terms. She had always played quietly, in the small spaces of her life, not expecting recognition. Yet here she was, being told that her music mattered, that it had the power to move people. The orchestra members nodded and smiled at her, some offering small gestures of encouragement. She realized that she was no longer just an observer in this hall. She was part of the music, part of the performance, part of something much bigger than herself. After the rehearsal, she sat quietly at the piano for a few moments, letting the final echoes of the music fade. She traced her fingers over the keys, remembering every note she had played, every feeling she had poured into the performance. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the connection she had made, the way music had allowed her to speak without words. Outside the concert hall, the streets of Madrid were alive with evening lights. Isabella walked slowly, feeling a new sense of confidence. The city that had seemed so vast and intimidating yesterday now felt like a place of possibility. She hummed the melody she had played, letting it carry her forward, reminding her that this was only the beginning. She thought about her family back home, about the small keyboard she had learned on, about the hours she had spent practicing in quiet rooms. Every moment had led to this one, and she felt grateful for the journey. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. As she returned to her small hostel room, she opened her notebook and began to write down the melody she had improvised, adding notes and thoughts about the emotions it carried. She wanted to remember everything so that when the next day arrived, she could bring the same honesty and passion to the piano once again. That night, as she lay down to sleep, she realized something important. Music was more than notes and rhythms. It was a way to tell stories, to share life, to connect people across distances and experiences. And for the first time, she felt that her story, her music, truly belonged in the world. She closed her eyes, letting the day's events replay in her mind. The applause, the orchestra, the conductor's words. And as she drifted into sleep, a quiet smile spread across her face, knowing that tomorrow would bring another chance to let her music shine. The morning of the big performance arrived with a quiet intensity. Isabella woke up before sunrise, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and orange. Even from her small hostel window, she could hear the distant hum of the city waking up, the sounds of people walking, street vendors calling out, and the faint ringing of a church bell. Today felt different. It was not just another rehearsal or practice session. It was a moment that could change everything. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple, neat outfit. She wanted to feel confident, but not draw attention away from the music. Her long dark hair was tied back tightly, her fingers already itching for the piano. She carried her small notebook, filled with her melodies and notes from the previous days, almost like a talisman. It reminded her of how far she had come, of every small step that had led her here. Walking toward the concert hall, Isabella felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. The streets of Madrid were alive with movement, the bright morning light bouncing off the buildings. People hurried past her, many unaware of the small-town pianist who was about to step onto one of Europe's grandest stages. And yet she felt a strange calm, a sense that she was ready, that this was what she was meant to do. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was electric. Musicians were taking their places, tuning their instruments and whispering quietly among themselves. There was a larger audience today, Ray. Porters, music students, and guests who had come to witness something extraordinary. Isabella took her usual seat near the piano and waited, her hands folded on her lap. She could feel her heart pounding, but she focused on the rhythm, letting it prepare her rather than frighten her. The conductor arrived shortly, his usual commanding presence filling the hall, but today there was a warmth in his expression, a hint of pride. He approached Isabella and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Today is yours," he said softly. "Remember, play with honesty and the music will guide you." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I will," she whispered, though her voice trembled slightly. When the orchestra began their introduction, Isabella felt the familiar surge of energy. The notes wrapped around her, guiding her hands as she moved to the piano. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The piano felt alive beneath her touch, as if it knew the story she wanted to tell. She began with soft, deliberate notes, each one carrying emotion. The melody was her own, yet it was universal, a language that everyone in the hall could understand. The conductor watched her closely, but he did not interfere. He allowed her to lead, letting her music shape the orchestra rather than controlling it. The audience was silent. They could sense something rare was happening. People who had come expecting a standard performance now leaned forward, captivated by the sound. Isabella's music was not just notes and chords. It was a living story full of life, struggle, and hope. As she continued, her confidence grew. The melody flowed naturally, weaving through moments of softness and intensity. She thought of her family back home, of the small town where she had spent countless hours teaching herself, of the streets where children played, and the markets where her mother had worked. All of that lived in her music, and the audience could feel it. The orchestra followed her lead, adding harmonies and textures that enriched the sound without overpowering it. Every instrument seemed to respond to her emotions, creating a performance that felt spontaneous yet perfectly balanced. Isabella realized that she was no longer playing alone. She was guiding a collective story, a musical conversation that transcended words. The conductor's baton moved gracefully, guiding the orchestra with precision, but even he seemed caught up in the music. His usual control gave way to trust, allowing Isabella's improvisation to dictate the rhythm and flow. He had seen many talented musicians, but there was something unique in her playing, an honesty and depth that was impossible to teach. Isabella reached a part of the piece that was particularly bold. She struck the keys with intensity, letting the sound fill the hall completely. The notes seemed to soar, carrying with them a sense of freedom and determination. The audience was spellbound, leaning forward in their seats, unable to look away. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them like a wave. She thought about all the moments that had led to this point, the long hours of practice, the doubts she had faced, the small victories that had built her confidence. And she realized that every note she played was more than just sound. It was a reflection of her life, her struggles, and her dreams. The melody shifted, becoming softer and more introspective. She played with delicate precision, letting the piano sing with emotion. The orchestra followed, their sound gentle, almost like a whisper that complemented her music. The audience felt the intimacy, the vulnerability, and responded with quiet admiration. Then, Isabella allowed the music to rise again, building in strength and emotion. Her fingers moved faster, guided by instinct and feeling. The notes soared, creating a sense of exhilaration that filled the hall. The conductor's movements became more animated, encouraging the orchestra to respond fully to her lead. The musicians, inspired by her energy, played with renewed passion, creating a symphony that was alive and dynamic. The audience began to sense the climax approaching. There was an electricity in the air, a collective anticipation. Isabella's final section approached, and she poured everything she had into it. Her joy, her hope, her love for music, and the courage that had carried her this far. Every note resonated with intensity, filling the hall and reaching into the hearts of everyone present. As the final chord lingered in the air, there was a moment of complete silence. The sound seemed to hang, vibrating in the walls and in the hearts of those listening. Then slowly applause erupted. It started softly, a ripple of appreciation, and grew into a powerful wave. People stood clapping enthusiastically, some with tears in their eyes. The orchestra members smiled, some even cheering quietly, moved by the performance. Isabella bowed, her chest heaving, a shy smile on her face. She had never imagined that her music could touch so many people, that her emotions, her story, could be felt across the hall. She had played with honesty, and the world had responded. The conductor approached her once more, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You have shown us something rare," he said quietly. "Your music is not just skill, and it is life itself. You have reminded us why we play, why we listen, and why we believe in the power of music." Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes. She had never sought recognition, never dreamed of applause, but hearing those words, feeling the respect and admiration, filled her with a deep, quiet joy. She realized that this moment was not just about her performance, but about the connection she had made with the orchestra, the audience, and the music itself. After the performance, people came forward to congratulate her. Musicians she had watched from afar now shook her hand, smiling warmly. Reporters asked her about her inspiration, students asked for advice, and audience members shared how deeply the music had moved them. Isabella listened quietly, smiling and nodding, feeling both overwhelmed and grateful. She thought about her family back home, imagining their faces as she recounted the experience. She thought about the small piano she had started on, the long nights of practice, the dreams she had almost hidden from the world. And she realized that every step had led her here, to a moment where her music could be shared, understood, and celebrated. Later, as the hall emptied and the musicians packed up, Isabella sat at the piano one last time. She pressed a few soft notes, letting the melody linger in the air. A private moment of reflection. She smiled, knowing that this experience would stay with her forever. A reminder of the courage it took to step forward, and the magic that comes when honesty and passion guide your hands. Walking back through the streets of Madrid that evening, the city lights shimmering on the cobblestones, Isabella felt a sense of peace and accomplishment. She had faced fear, embraced opportunity, and shared a part of herself with the world. She realized that the music inside her was not just for her own enjoyment. It was a gift, a way to connect, to inspire, and to remind people of the beauty that exists in honesty and courage. As she reached her hostel, she paused to look at the city one more time. She knew that this was only the beginning, that there were more notes to play, more stories to tell, and more hearts to touch. And for the first time, she felt completely ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that the music would guide her every step of the way. That night, as she lay in bed, Isabella closed her eyes and heard the echoes of the grand piano in her mind. She remembered the orchestra, the audience, the conductor's words, and the applause. And she realized something profound. Music was not just sound. It was life itself, a bridge between people, a way to share truth and emotion without words. She smiled quietly, feeling a deep contentment. She had taken a risk, stepped into the unknown, and discovered something greater than herself. And she knew that wherever life took her next, she would carry the music inside her, letting it guide her, inspire her, and touch the world in ways she had only begun to imagine. The journey that began with a single note, a shy step onto a piano, and a quiet heart had transformed into something extraordinary. Isabella Cruz had found her voice, her courage, and her place in the world of music. And as the night settled over Madrid, the city seemed to echo with the memory of her song, a melody that would linger in the hearts of all who had heard it, forever.